Welcome everyone to the second session of our seminar on the Personalist Vision. We are joined, as you've noticed, no doubt, by our friends Rocco Buttiglione and Josef Seifert, coming to us respectively from Italy, and I think Josef's in Austria right now. They will be discussing the major figures in personalism, particularly Wojtyla and Hildebrand. So with that, let me turn it over to you, gentlemen. Would one of you like to speak first?
Rocco.
Josef.
Rocco.
I was told he would speak first, so we have to.
You take the lead and I follow you.
Okay.
Oh, if you want, otherwise I can do it. I need an order in order to be able to.
Okay. All right, Rocco. The order is you first, Rocco.
Too many already in my life.
So we'll begin with you, Rocco. Thank you.
Okay.
So.
Then I go. Well, let me please, first of all, tell all my joy in being today together with you, with those whom I can see, my old friend Josef and my old friend Christopher, and those I cannot see. Among them, I know there are beautiful ladies that I always hope to see, like Maria and Katrina and many others. Let's now turn to the topics of today. Personalism, great figures in the history of personalism. And in particular, you expect me to say a few words on Karol Wojtyla. If I were to say what is the greatest contribution of Wojtyla to personalism, I think it is the rethinking of the idea of person, starting first with the immediate experience of the subject, of the human being. And second, centering on that peculiar human experience that is the encounter of man with another man, and especially of men with women. Many of you must have read the phenomenology of the spirit of Hegel. Human society begins with the clash of two self-consciousness. And one of them must become the Lord and the other one must become the slave. In contemporary philosophy, in La critique de la raison dialectique, Jean-Paul Sartre has reproposed the same model. The first problem that we have to solve is who is the boss, who stands in command. And human society are born and grow through a clash in which different self-consciousnesses try to propose themselves as dominant. One of them wins, and the others must obey, become slaves. One becomes the Lord, the others become the slaves. Wojtyla offers us a different model to understand the genesis of human society. It is, I shall not say that the model of Hegel is false. I think it is true, 50%. But there is, thanks God, another 50% in human experience. And you see this in the relationship between men and women. When you fall in love, but more in general, when you meet a lady, then, when you fall in love, you want to possess the body of the person you are in love with. And she is an object for you, no doubt. But you realize that this object is at the same time a subject, and that she's not just a body. And in the metaphysics of shame, in Love and Responsibility, there is a wonderful representation of the way in which men watch at women. Why are we dressed? In order to lead the eye of the other towards our eyes. And the eyes are the point in which we enter into the interiority of the other. There is another analysis of the eye in modern philosophy, in contemporary philosophy. Oh, I don't know whether I should call it contemporary because it's Well, it was contemporary when I was young, when Josef and I were young. Again, in La critique de la raison dialectique, you have this idea. I look to the world, and my eye objectifies the world. They are objects, I am a subject. And then I meet another one who is watching me, and this eye objectifies me. And I realize that I am an object for him, and I cannot tolerate this. And here begins the clash. Now, when you fall in love with a girl, you cannot, you desire her love. Love is not just obedience. It's not something that can be imposed. It is an act of the freedom. And the encounter of the eyes is the moment in which one freedom enters in relation with the freedom of the other. And this is accompanied by the experience of beauty. Beauty means that the affective center of my reality, my heart, is drawn out of myself. My affective center is no more in myself, but is in her, or somewhere between me and her, let us say, on the way between me and her, so that I cannot define what I am without encompassing her freedom and her good. And this breaks the spell of modern philosophy. Modern philosophy begins with Descartes. Cogito ergo sum. I think, and therefore I am. And the other, I have to arrive to the consciousness of the existence of the other through a rather complicated set of reasonings. But here, no. I am equally sure of the existence of the other as I am sure of my own existence. I might even say that I am more sure of the existence of my wife than I am of my own existence or of my children, because as a rule, from the encounter between men and women, children are born. And I realized that the person is a relation. I live in the relation to other human beings. And I learn who I am in this relation. There is the hymn of the Holy Spirit that says, in your light, we see the light. This can be said of the encounter of men with God, but also of the encounter of men with the other man. Because this encounter of man with woman, or of father with child, or of course also of the child with the father, or of the even better with the mother, this is also the paradigm of all encounters of human beings among themselves. Whenever we meet another human being, we have in ourselves two different archetypes, and they both work. The archetype of Hegel and the archetype of Wojtyla, which is dominant. Well, it depends on the circumstances, on the situations. The idea of sanctity is the idea of the predominance of the archetype of Wojtyla on the archetype of Hegel. Sometimes it happens also in the life of poor sinners like we are. But when this happens in a more definite way, and when it acquires a more universal form, then we say, oh, look, this is a saint. Shall I stop here, Christopher, or shall I go on? Because you know, professors are terrible. They could go on and on forever, yeah. Especially when they talk about something like.
You can, yeah, why don't you start wrapping up in a couple minutes here?
A couple of minutes?
Finish your points. Yeah.
Good. Let me say a couple of words on another great philosopher. I was, and I hope I still am, a friend with Josef Seifert. In my opinion, Josef Seifert has given a great contribution to this renewal of personalist thought, moving this from the field of anthropology to the field of metaphysics. In the book, oh, by the way, a little bit of bibliography. If you want to control what I've said on Wojtyla, if you want to deepen these ideas, there are three texts you should read. The first one is the person as a subject and the community. The second one is the family as a community of persons. And the third one is being father or mother as communion of persons. Here you find more enlarged and more in depth the basic concepts that I have tried to explain. In his book on Essere e Persona, I say it in Italian because the first edition was in Italian and I translated it. Seifert puts this category of person within the context of classical metaphysics. Normally, metaphysics begins with being, with the being as being. Seifert suggests that metaphysics should begin with the metaphysics of the person. That is, metaphysics should begin with what Aristotle calls on katexoken. Being is given in the human person, in the person, in God's person even more, but also in the human person, because there are three kinds of person: man, angels, and God. God is given in the human person in a much deep, not God, excuse me, being is given in the human person in a way that is much deeper and more beautiful and more full of meaning and with a greater capacity to explain the totality of being if you start considering being on katexoken, being par excellence. That is the person. I think it is the point in which Josef Professor Seifert, excuse me, continues the great reflection of Wojtyla and of his personalism.
Okay, thank you, Rocco. That seems like a great segue to you, Joseph. Are you with us here? Professor Seifert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you still see me? Do
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
we can see and hear you.
Yeah, very well. Well, I am supposed to say a few words about the true personalism of Dietrich von Hildebrand. And I entitled my paper, which I don't read, but I will freely speak, the true personalism of Dietrich von Hildebrand, in order to emphasize that personalism per se is not necessarily a good philosophy or a true philosophy. And there are many personalisms or many kinds of understand personalism that are very bad, and others are extremely good in a certain high point in the history of philosophy. And I think the three main, Hildebrand is free of three main errors, into which quite a few personalists fell, starting already to some extent from the beginning of the modern term personalism. I am of the opinion that personalism exists since ages, at least since Christianity, because to believe that God is three persons in one God is the climax of personalism and of thinking that the supreme being is the person. But one could say in the modern understanding, it was Mounier who started this movement, and there already, I think, we find many personalists, so-called personalists, who are much less personalist than, for example, Thomas Aquinas or some classical thinkers. So I believe that the main errors that some modern personalists committed are first a kind of subjectivistic understanding of personalism, that it goes back to some extent the father of personalism, Immanuel Kant, whose statement in the foundation of a metaphysics of morals, that only if there's something of absolute value can there be moral imperatives, and that absolute value can be attributed to the person, and who then adds that you should never treat a person merely as a means, but always also as an end. And that statement is, so to speak, the key statement of the Polish personalism of Karol Wojtyla, Tadeusz Styczyn, and a whole number of other thinkers of that school. And in Kant, we find, besides this beautiful statement and this wonderful intuition, we find an extreme subjectivistic understanding of the person, because the person is basically the human person who, in his transcendental consciousness, creates to some extent the world instead of finding the things in themselves, reality itself. And he even creates, as Kant says, God. The idea of God is entirely made up by the human reason. So there's no transcendent God, authentically real, but only God whom we made. So we can say that personalism in this form that is influenced by Kant is a very subjectivistic philosophy, not at all a realist personalism. But Hildebrand was profoundly realist personalist. His book, What is Philosophy, gives is a kind of magna charta of realist personalism and realist phenomenology. And sees the nature of knowledge not as creative or constituting the world, so as if everything would depend on human personal consciousness, but rather as finding, discovering a reality that is independent of the human consciousness. And Hildebrand also counters a second big error of false personalism, that is a kind of belief that if one takes seriously the person, one must not submit the person to some universal laws. That would be a legalism, and therefore situation ethics and later the purely proportionalist ethics appeared to be the true personalist ethics. And Hildebrand wrote, and I think that destroys the foundation of ethics if one denies that they are intrinsically good or evil acts. I just wrote a book on the splendor of the good and intrinsically evil acts, about the thinking of John Paul II and of Karol Wojtyla on this matter. And so I think that the ethics presupposes that absoluteness. And in Hildebrand, in his book, Critique of Situation Ethics, he insists deeply and gives very refined and differentiated account of the fact that it is impossible to reduce the substance of moral good and evil to always changing situations where at a time murder or abortion or adultery can be justified, depending also on the consequences. And thirdly, I think another big error that is also completely foreign to the personalism of Hildebrand is to identify the concept of man and the concept of person. Because man, or the human person, is, of course, each man is a person, as personalists rightly said, or many personalists rightly said, from conception on, each human being is a person. But this personhood that is, as Professor Crosby said in the previous session, so to speak, potentially possessed by that person who is already a real person. The embryo is a real person, the mentally retarded is a real person, but he possesses, so to speak, the specific characteristics of personhood in a kind of not yet actualized, not yet fully actualized way. And so I think that that to identify the personhood with human personhood is a profound error, because one forgets that the human person is in a certain way, the weakest of all persons. Angels are much higher persons by nature, and God, of course, is infinitely higher. So the archetype, the fundamental person is not the human person. And so to believe that personalism turns, so to speak, anthropology or philosophy of man into the main discipline of philosophy, I think overlooks that the metaphysics of the person and the insight that all the marks of personhood, knowledge, wisdom, free will, heart, affective life, spiritual forms of affectivity are possessed by human persons in a very imperfect sense. And in Hildebrand, we can say there's constantly this awareness that the person is not reduced to human person, but that the absolute divine persons are the most fullest person. And therefore, the fundamental ethical personalist principle that the person ought to be loved and to be recognized as such for his own dignity, for his own value, that principle is not identical with man has to be affirmed for his own sake or has to be loved for his own sake, because the primary love, the most profound love, and affirmation of the person for her own sake or his own sake is in the love of God. And therefore, if, so to speak, this transcendent dimension of personalism is lost, and personalism is a pure humanism, a pure philosophy in which man stands in the center, I think it is quite a twist away from the true personalism in its metaphysical dimension. And of course, one might say that for the Christian philosopher, and Hildebrand was of course a convert to Catholicism and a very fervent Catholic, of course, we can say that in some extent, the human person and the divine person are joining in a unique way by the fact of the incarnation. So the God-man is both God, Christ is both God, fully God, and fully man. But his human nature is assumed by the divine person. So we can say here, in some ways, the humanity becomes so deeply connected in this hypostatic union, as the scholastic said, with the divine person that we can say the adoration of the person, also of the humanity of Christ, is quite legitimate. So at any rate, I think Hildebrand, besides avoiding these three errors, one can say maybe the Nietzschean statement is a kind of implication of this atheist humanism or atheist personalism, when he says that if there were God, if God existed, I could never bear not to be God, therefore there is no God. I drew the conclusion, but now the conclusion draws me, he says. Now, so this kind of atheistic humanism or personalism, which Leduc in his book on the atheist humanism has analyzed deeply, this kind, of course, is the opposite of what Hildebrand's personalism would like to affirm, and the Sartre's kind of conception of freedom, as Mark Spencer already explained. Now, I believe that Hildebrand analyzed, first of all, he was deeply convinced that there's no greater metaphysical difference than between persons and non-personal beings. So let's say that the donkey, who for Darwin is already like one night before humanity, is for Hildebrand the most distant in all of nature. Not even matter is as distant from the person than, so that so to speak, the difference between the animal and the person is a huge ontological difference, despite the wonderful type of consciousness of animals, the kind of the relationship they have to human beings, to the wonder of animals. But nevertheless, the difference between them and the person is still huge. And of course, Hildebrand said that the even much greater difference is between God and the human person, the divine person and the human person. So we can say that the personhood in Hildebrand's the value of the person, the dignity of the person is, of course, centrally important in Hildebrand's thought. And he analyzed the main faculties of the person, the knowledge in his book, What is Philosophy, the free will in his Ethics, and the heart in his book, The Heart. So he analyzed 3 spiritual centers of the person in a very uniquely differentiated way. And so he contributed not only by overcoming these 3 errors, but by a positive understanding of the person very deeply to personalism. And he, of course, understood that these 3 fundamental centers of the heart, of the will, and of the intellect also do not belong just to the human person, but that in God himself, one must assume the fire, we can say, of love, the ardor of love, so that the feelings are not just like what combines men with animals, but Hildebrand's great contribution to personalism is to show that there are spiritual forms of affectivity that are fully personal, that are fully spiritual, and that can also be deeply linked to the free will, which he analyzed in his chapter on the cooperative freedom in his Ethics. So, well, and we may say that the central topic of the Wojtylian ethical personalism, that the person ought to be affirmed and loved for her own sake or for his own sake, is quite crucial for Hildebrand. His whole book on the nature of love insists that when we love a person, we are not just searching for our happiness. In this respect, one could say personalism is linked to freeing ethics from the kind of Aristotelian eudaimonism, that everything man desires ultimately, the ultimate end he desires is happiness. And so this kind of self-centeredness of happiness being the supreme goal for which everything else is a means is quite broken in Hildebrand's personalism and also in Wojtyla's personalism, in the sense that the gift of oneself to a beloved person, to the other, is central to understand the person. This transcendence not only of the intellect in knowing reality that is independent of the subject, but also of the will and of the heart, that kind of affirmation of and praise also of God and affirmation of another person for his or her own sake, and that self-donation to another person, which is, so to speak, the innermost movement of love. And so I do not want to extend my 10-minute speech. I probably already extended it and feel already that Christopher frowns at me, but I don't see him at the moment.
No, I'm smiling with you, Joseph.
So, anyways, I think that I will have later an occasion to speak about Hildebrand's philosophy, personalist philosophy of the ultimate end, the ultimate purpose, the ultimate vocation of the person, and so I will not develop that point here. But I want to say that I believe one aspect of Hildebrand's personalism is also the very profound union between philosophy and between reason and faith. His book, The Transformation in Christ, I think analyzes philosophically profoundly those specific virtues of humility, of mercy, of peacefulness, and others that are, so to speak, born by the encounter with that unique person of the God-man. and he interprets the Sermon of the Mount, the Beatitudes, and these specifically Christian virtues he shows have their own intelligible nature and beauty, so that even non-Christians like Bergson, for example, recognize the superior holiness, the superior moral quality compared, for example, to the marvelous Socratic moral personality that exists in those saints who respond to that new light, to that great mystery, to that infinite descending love of God, which we believe in as Christians. So with this, I conclude. I had hundreds of other thoughts, but I don't want to extend my limited time.
Well, thank you to both of you, and we will have plenty of time throughout the week. I know with some other sessions and here now also in the Q&A. So we have a few minutes for questions. Everyone in the audience, please feel free to start adding your questions to the Q&A here, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So we have a couple of questions related to a particular theme that I'll try to condense here. I'd be very curious for your thoughts. A couple people ask about, well, one asked in specific about Eric Shivara and Karol Wojtyla, and another about what personalism might have to say about the analogy, essentially the analogy being of the analogy antis between God and man. I'm personally not so sure what did Wojtyla and Shivara have anything really to do with one another? Do you all have anything to add on that?
I don't remember Wojtyla quoting Shivara, although Shivara was surely influential in the cultural atmosphere in which Wojtyla developed his thought. I think that a link between Shivara and Wojtyla is Ansurs von Balthasar. Ansurs von Balthasar was a student of Shivara, and the vision of Shivara on the human person is largely incorporated in the theological and theological, but with a lot of philosophy in them, theological works of von Balthasar. And I think especially in Glory, in the first volume of Glory, the perception of the form. Here, this point of view is, in one sense, taken directly from Shivara. It regards again the concept of being and the beginning of metaphysics. And until you do not perceive the beauty of the reality around you, you cannot have an adequate perception of what is being. Being, and here in Shivara, you might draw also a parallel between Shivara and von Hildebrand, because the idea of being is not that of a pure formal ontology. Being incorporates the experience of beauty and the experience of harmony. This leads to the idea of pure perfections. All perfections are limited. All of the perceptions that we see in the world are limited. It is good to be tall, but not if you are too tall. It is good to be strong, but here again, a man who is too strong might resemble an ox. And what is that we can consider as a pure perfection? It is the harmony. The harmony is the correct proportion among things. And in the harmony of the human body, in the harmony of a landscape, you perceive that being is at the same time a sign. And this sign deserves to be understood. And this is infinite. Harmony, can you imagine an excess of harmony? No, you can't. Perfect harmony is perfect. And it is, whenever you have more harmony, you have more of the presence of beauty in of being in reality. This idea of the connection between beauty and being, and then beauty, being, and person is extremely important to Wojtyla. You find it in his philosophical works, but even more you find it in his poetical works. There is a small book of poems that he wrote after a pilgrimage to the Holy Land that begins, że tej ziemi nie możesz powiedzieć, jesteś piękny. Of this land you cannot say you are beautiful. And only you realize the beauty of this land when you put it in connection with the metaphysical beauty that came to find in this land its adequate expression in the person of Jesus Christ. So here, the link between anthropology, metaphysics, and theology, here you can see in Wojtyla a presence of Trivara mediated by von Balthasar. Wojtyla held von Balthasar in great esteem. He wanted to make him a cardinal, but unfortunately, von Balthasar died a few days before participating in Rome to the consistorum where he was to be made a cardinal.
Thank you. That is very illuminating. We have some questions in the chat about Shivara. I think we've got the links listed there. And
Shivara is known to the younger generation. I thought
there was a recent translation and publication of his major work, Analogia Entis, in English, and so I think that has. What's that?
Which book has been translated in English? The book on man.
The Analogia Entis.
The Analogia. Well,
so it's an excellent.
Stayed up to now. The analogy is the capacity of seeing the infinite in the finite. Of course, this could be the object of the scientific demonstration. It has to be perceived. And in this sense, without at least a certain amount of phenomenology, you cannot understand neither Shivara and not even the real meaning of the demonstration of the existence of God in St. Thomas that Shivara explains.
I would love to keep going down this particular path, but we'll have to save it on our next till our next seminar on Shivara and personalism. Let's try to get to a couple more questions before we have to wrap up here. This one is particularly for Dr. Seifert, and then Rocco, you feel free to chime in as well. John Kish asks, why is it better for Hildebrand to begin with the person rather than being? How does this avoid Cartesian self-centeredness as the first principle?
Well, that's a very good question, but I think, that is the main thesis also of my book, Essere Persona, Being in Person. I think that to start with being and to follow the Aristotelian being qua being, or to on he on, has many different meanings. It can be the most universal, general properties of being, and first principles of being, like a principle of contradiction. It can be the analysis of the different fundamental forms of being, like the categories, or it can be the question, what is being in the most proper sense? And the Aristotelian answer to that question is the substance. The substance is being in the primary sense. And I think that response is not false, because I think not like Dr. Spencer, that the person is relation. I think the person needs to be a member who enters into relation but cannot be resolved into relation. And that the community and relations is crucial for understanding the person, but the person is not a relation. I think even not the divine persons can be relations, otherwise there will be many persons in God, because the relation of the Father to the Son, of the Father to the Holy Spirit, of the Holy Spirit to the Son, and so on. There are many. So I think a person is not reducible to relation. The Thomistic understanding is the person, and the Boethian understanding the person is individual substance of rational nature. And I think that definition remains crucial, even if one understands the essential relatedness of the person and the call of the person to community of persons, the communio personarum, as so to speak, the climax of personal existence and relation in one. And of course, Hildebrand in his metaphysics of community has analyzed this very profoundly, the self-standing being of the person, but at the same time, the intimate and necessary and ultimate calling to be a member of a community. Anyways, so I think if one starts with the person, one does not leave being, but rather one understands that person, to be self-conscious, awakened, endowed with free will and so on, is being in the primary sense. So the third question of being qua being, or the third meaning of being qua being, Aristotle does not distinguish these very much, but I think a third meaning that we can identify is precisely being in the most proper sense. What is primarily being? And there Aristotle gives the answer, substance. And I think the personalist philosophers like Hildebrand, like Karol Wojtyla, like Dietrich, like Rocco, Buttiglione, like Josef, Seifert, would give the answer. The being in the primary sense is not enough to say substance, but it is personal being. And the person is being in the primary sense. And then one can have a fourth meaning of to on, he on, or being qua being, and that is being in the absolute sense. And I think here only God is being in the primary, absolutely primary sense. And I think I may slightly contradict Rocco Buttiglione, because I think the perfections he named, of course, are essentially limited. Like to be a strong man with big muscles, or to be a beautiful lion. These are limited perfections. One cannot think of an infinite lion, of an infinitely strong, muscular man. But I think the so-called pure perfections, which Anselm of Canterbury distinguished from the mixed, or from the perfections secundum quid, these are potentially infinite. And as long as they are finite, like in all of us, beauty is finite, intelligence is finite, wisdom is finite, kindness is finite, love is finite. So in us, they are finite, but by their nature, they admit of infinity. And we could even say only when they are infinite, that is only when they are in God, are they fully themselves. Only God is being itself, only God is wisdom itself, is goodness itself. And therefore, we can say these pure perfections, I think, give a deep entrance door to some real understanding of the divine nature. I don't know whether this answers your question, but
I hope so. We'll find out in the comments, and it might prompt some more questions. We have time for a couple more, and I'm going to try to get some practical questions in here for some people who want to know what to do. Let me ask. This is a question, I guess from Catherine Yanko and Alex Plato. Given that personalism is a response to both collectivism and individualism in social and political philosophy and history, do you think personalism has a distinctive third way between or beyond the typical division within modern societies of right and left, Is this a key theme or a secondary one? So I think this would apply certainly both to Wojtyla and to Hildebrand, who are reacting against both of these movements. But I think the second question here at the end is quite interesting. Is this a key theme or sort of a secondary one? Is it an effect of personalism that it marks this middle way or third way between collectivism and individualism, or is this something really essential to personalism?
I would say, if I may, that Hildebrand thought of we can say of such opposites like individualism or collectivism, that the true solution is not in the middle between these two errors, but rather is beyond and combines whatever is true in each of these two positions, but is not, so to speak, the methodes or the middle way between these two extremes. And so, like, for example, the virtue of generosity is not the middle way between greediness, between stinginess and wastefulness. Rather, it moves, so to speak, on quite another level. It's above both and may have, yeah, and it excludes both, but yeah, so, but so this idea that between individualism and collectivism is personalism, I think would be not a correct way of presenting the thing. Rather, true personalism, and I speak true personalism because there are many false personalism, but true personalism, I think, combines the insistence of the human being a member, person being a member of community, with the understanding of the full individuality and uniqueness of each person. Each person is an absolutely unique, irreplaceable, unrepeatable being. And that, I think, both of these, therefore I'm not quite agreeing with Mark Spencer that to be an individual is egocentric or whatever, because I think to be an individual is quite an intrinsically important feature of personhood. Not only to be an individual like each dog, my dog is an individual, and she's a very striking individual. But I think the person has a personal uniqueness that is more than just being individual. And so I think in that sense, that is crucial both for love of a unique person, the other person, but also for realizing one's own mission and dignity. No person can ever be substituted or replaced or repeated by any other person. That is, I think, one of the magnificent insights also of Duns Scotus, the Heccheitas, this you can say irreplaceable thisness and individuality in the highest sense. And Hildebrand, in his book Metaphysics of Community, distinguishes three directions in which the individuality of a being goes. And well, if you like, I can continue on that, but I think I should not.
Only because we're coming close to the end of the hour, which we're already extending just a little bit. And
yeah,
thank you for that.
I'm obedient to you before you even give an order.
Well, I wanted also to give Rocco a chance to respond to that same question.
I think we should start with the relation between substance and relation in the person. The person is a substance, a unique substance, that is revealed to itself in the relation to others. And we should consider at the same time that there are two different kinds of relations that converge in the person. I think Wojtyla von Hildebrand also notices this in his book on the metaphysics of community. because it says that communities are not persons, are quasi-persons. Here he's very similar to St. Thomas. Nevertheless, we must distinguish between human communities and that particular community that is the church, because the church is a real person. Why? Because at the beginning of the human substance, there is the relation to God. Here, the relation is the basis of the existence of the person. The magnificent individuality of this one, of each human being, is founded upon the relation of this person to God. We might say it is a particular reflection of the beauty of God. And the Transcendentals introduce us into this dimension, that is a dimension of the human person, and that at the same time of God, allow us to enter into a relation with God. Now, in the human communities that are quasi-persons, what is the great danger? That the human community takes the place of the communion with God. That is, that the states or the human communities present themselves as churches. And in this way, pretend to give to man the very reason for his subsistence. Now, the human person comes before all human communities. As what regards liberalism and collectivism, Wojtyla writes very well in just in the article that I quoted before, the person as subject and as community. To be a community is a dimension of the human person, and it is not just a middle way between, it is something different. It is, we must go back to the idea of common good. The common good, what is the common good? It is the sum of different goods that so constitutes the good of the community? No. The common good is, first of all, a dimension of the person that understands the constitutive relation to God, and at the same time, the fact that his truth is revealed in the relation to other persons cannot define the individual good without including in the individual good the good of others. This is particularly apparent in the relation of man and wife, father and children, the family. Can you define your good, your individual good, without encompassing in this good the good of your family? But in the same way, you cannot define your individual good if you do not encompass in this good the good of the community you live in, of the other persons. For these persons, you are somehow responsible. They are part of you, without losing each one of them, naturally. Of course, its individual substance. So if you want to approach the issues of the economy on the basis of a personalist view, then you must start with this idea of the common good. Usually, we make the economic science begin with Adam Smith, with the book on the inquiry into the causes of the wealth of nations. There is another beginning. A few years before Smith, Antonio Genovesi wrote a book, Elementi di economia civile, and whilst in elements of civil economy, and whilst in Smith, the interest of the individual is put as the beginning, or in Marx, some years later, the interest of the collectivity is put as the beginning. Genovesi explains that there are two sources of human economic action. One is the interest of the individual, but the other one is the preoccupation for the good of the community. With a group of friends at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, I mentioned here my friend Stefano Zamagni, and we are working on rethinking the foundations of economic science. Because the real economic action does not correspond to what is theoretized in the handbooks of the economy. Men do not act just on the basis of self-interest. The other element is always present in the human action. And this leads to seeing in a different way, on the On the one hand, what it is to be an entrepreneur, an economic actor. You have to be also a leader of a community. On the other hand, it leads you to understand in a different way the relation obtaining between economy and politics. A good society needs the economic motivation, the market, but needs also to surround the market with strong institutions, with ethical, moral, political, juridical, and religious institutions that orient the market, putting it in the service of the human person.
Thank you both. We're out of time. I'm going to ask one other question, but we're not going to answer it yet. I just want to pose it so everyone knows it's posed, and we are going to come back to it. In the chat, you all might have seen there's a lot of interest and discussion about further readings, and so I'm going to go ahead and ask you to be thinking about what your recommendations would be for 3 to 5 books that are essential personalist reading by any number of authors. They don't have to just be Hildebrand or Wojtyla. So we'll get that from you all after and share it in the chat or in one of the emails. For now, however, we're going to have to wrap up as we're a few minutes after time. I do want to let everyone know for full participants and the small group sessions will start immediately after this. You have the links in the emails that you have received from Catherine. If you don't have that, please email us and we'll get that to you. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Rocco and Josef, for being with us. It's always a pleasure, even though we're so far away. It's great to be in conversation with you both, and we look forward to more conversations throughout the week. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.